for me. So I almost feel like my throat might be a little bit rough from lack of speech, but it's very nice to be here. I am talking today about some work I've been working on for the last, I think, about 5 years around climax thinking, and I'll explain what that means as I go forward. But I just want to also acknowledge that the work I'm talking about today is not just research I've done, but it's research that I've done with a number of students out of my lab, particularly Master of Environmental Studies students, Christina Kelty, Ellen Chappell, Krista Sutton, and Samantha Howard. Samantha Howard's still in program, actually. She's still working on hers, and with various funding sources. But before we get going, in Canada, it's very common to do what's called a land acknowledgement, which is where we kind of talk about the ancestral territory that we work on. And Dalhousie is located in Mi'kma'ki, and the areas that are in green here are Mi'kma'ki, and this is the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq. And that is, covers Nova Scotia, which is kind of the large, kind of pendulous peninsula here, Prince Edward Island, bits of New Brunswick and Quebec. And what we say here is that we're all treaty people, even still, because the Treaty of Peace and Friendship that the Mi'kmaq signed with the British in the mid-1700s did not actually cede their land rights, their land title, or any other rights. So we try to remind ourselves at the beginning of what we do that we're kind of indebted to these ancestral kind of stewards of our land. And as am I here in Sabaganagati, around Nova Scotia and Halifax, Nova Scotia. So what I hope to do first here in this talk is introduce climax thinking, the idea of climax thinking, and then go through just some examples of the empirical work, just really small projects, because this has been stuff that's been on the corner of my desk for a couple of years, and then synthesize a couple of key messages out of those 3 empirical projects. And the projects, one of them is on renewable energy, specifically wind, one on coastal adaptation, and the other one on public flood risk mapping, sorry. And so I'm going to synthesize some key messages and then talk about some of the lingering questions, some of the things that I'm working on now. And to get started talking about climax thinking, I think it's helpful to talk about the study that first kind of brought me to thinking about this. And it was in a debate over a hydroelectric dam in New Brunswick. And this photo that I'm showing right now, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but in the far distance, there's a metal structure, and that is actually the dam structure, a hydroelectric dam structure. And what we see are people here who are visiting a beach that has been made possible really by the flooding of the head pond to power that dam. And on the left-hand side is a houseboat that will come into the discussion later. So in 1968, this dam was constructed, and back in 2012, 2013, they were trying to decide what to do with the dam, because ever since the 1968 construction, the dam has been kind of slowly failing because of a chemical reaction happening. They used the wrong aggregate when they were building it. And what I found really interesting when we went back to talk to people about what they wanted, so in 1968 and 2013 are not that far apart compared with most dam constructions. Lifespans. And so in many cases, it's the same people who are living in this area. Maybe they're living a little further back, but it's the same people. And so for instance, these are the kind of before and after the dam in this area. And in fact, I grew up on this head pond. And when I was a kid, older people had sometimes tried to show me pictures of what it looked like before the flooding, like photos like the one on the left. And I just couldn't place them in the landscape that I knew, which is the one on the right, just a very kind of domesticated and kind of flattened out landscape. And so a couple of years later, when I was doing this research, we created a story map. And it was, to be honest, the first time that I really understood, because I grew up in this little kind of manufactured town here, a mill town, but that was also constructed to hold people that were going to be displaced from the flooding. And so going back to that study in 2013, so like 20 plus years later from when I lived there, a couple of colleagues and I initiated research to understand how people in the area were experiencing the possibility of that dam being removed because it was no longer fit for purpose. And we actually put people and ran focus groups on the houseboat going up and down the head pond. And it was fascinating. So here's me and my little guy, George, he's now 9. And we were kind of talking to people about how they experienced the landscape. and today, and then how they might feel about the possibility of the decision being made to remove that dam. That decision hasn't been made, incidentally. They're going to extend its life. But then I was like, should go back here. This student here, Christina Kelty, then we didn't get a great distribution of kind of demographically on the houseboat tours, just because of who was able to make time available. And so Christina went back and did land-based interviews. And she did a really interesting analysis here. So I'll talk you through this diagram, but this is her kind of big synthesis diagram. And she spoke to people in 4 different kind of cohorts. People who were, adults before the dam came in, people who were children before the dam came in, people like me, head pond children, people who moved into the area or grew up in the area after the dam was in place, and so kind of knew only the head pond landscape, and then people who came in as adult migrants, sort of amenity migrants to the lake landscape that existed. And then she broke down the interviews also into time periods, so pre-dam perceptions, dam construction, and then today's dam perceptions, and then the possibility of dam removal and of dam rebuilding. And so on here, anything that is good is kind of blue, and anything that is bad is red. I'm sorry for those of you who are perhaps a bit colorblind. I didn't really think about the colors here. But the dam, what was fascinating is that no matter really what cohort, everybody perceived the dams today as predominantly positive and the possibility of removal as negative. And this got me sort of thinking about this idea of that it was whatever the current landscape was for these people was perceived as in its kind of ideal state. And so I started thinking about Clement's ideas of climax plant communities. So this is a diagram of succession, and it's kind of I think the theory of succession in ecology is a little bit unfashionable, because now ecologists have moved on to this idea that there's not just one kind of fated climax plant community for any given set of conditions, but that there are multiple possible futures, what they call kind of non-equilibrium thinking. But yet it seemed to me that while kind of ecologists had moved on to thinking about more dynamic landscape possibilities, those of us who are working in landscape change or kind of natural resource social science seem to be kind of anchored in this idea of an equilibrium, and always talking about place attachment and this as a grounded thing or as an inevitable thing. So if somebody, for instance, who loses, so in climax, in the plant community climax thinking, if there is a fire or there's some management, like grazing is done, then if that is done well, if the recovery is done well, then the same thing will come back. And so this capacity of a site to bounce back to what was this idea that we'd made good decisions and all was well, and in the original kind of Clementsian, it was about setting grazing rates so that the same plant community would be there. But I was kind of thinking about this in human terms. And so I started visualizing climax thinking like this individual who's sitting in the bubble up the top here, who, may be vaguely aware that there were previous landscape kind of iterations, but tries to hold their landscape in a current stasis. So this idea of climax thinking, kind of holding things the way that they are, rather than making changes for new needs, and particularly new public good needs. I'm less concerned, also obviously, of kind of enabling widespread development for capitalistic ends, but this idea that if we kind of hold ourselves in stasis, even though that is probably the landscape is going to degrade in its capacity to provide the kind of needs that we have, but it also pushes the implications of holding our landscape in stasis onto other people. So it pushes it to those elsewhere in the world, pushes it to other people who are neighbors, but who are less powerful, less, perhaps less influential politically. And so that that the kind of I'd say the pathology, which might be kind of a hypothetical thing, could be something about kind of exceptionalism, or it could be ignorance. And so I was trying to figure out what could drive these kind of thinking, and the resistance to the kind of changes that we need to make for sustainability. And so, for instance, if it's kind of a past-driven thing, it might be that we're thinking that previous land uses were just paving the way for this one, or maybe we're entirely ignorant of the fact that there were previous land uses. If it was kind of a future issue, then it might be that future generations matter than this, less than this one. So for instance, kind of a temporal discounting, or an assumption that we've just got such great solutions now in our current landscape that they'll continue to work forever. For instance, that degradation of fit is not going to happen. The third one, and just to kind of foreshadow, the one that's actually ended up to be the most powerful driver so far that I can tell, is this kind of self-other dimension, which is around that either someone elsewhere should need to accept change before I do, or that local decisions do not affect people, or personal decisions don't affect people elsewhere. So I'm going to go in and show you a couple of kind of just case studies of how I've been kind of dabbling in this idea. And so the first one is a wind energy study that took place in an area that had recently lost a kind of what do they call it? Microwave towers. So during the Second World War, we had these kind of Radio Canada microwave towers that were the kind of the voice of Canada overseas. And those came down in around 2014, around the same time as this big wind farm was being built within sight of the site of the international towers. And I thought this was really interesting because, how would people respond to this kind of tower versus the other? Because the old towers were really quite beloved in the area. They were a real landmark. And so Ellen Chappell picked this up as a study, and we were really playing, frankly, to trying to figure out what was going on. And so there's one of the most interesting things to come out of the study, I think, was that predicting support for wind development in sight of home, so that's the kind of predictor in this regression model, was predominantly predicted by two things. And the one at the bottom is the one that really interested me more. The one at the top was basically being open to the idea of export. Developing wind energy for export is something that's quite controversial. So those who are open to exporting energy, particularly here it would be to the United States, which are, big neighbors with lots of needs, but we're not terribly fond of them. That's interesting, but it was also not a great statement. I think we made it a bit double-barreled, so it's a little harder to see that clearly. But the one on the bottom is really interesting because it says, seeing wind turbines from my home reminds me that electricity I use has to be generated somewhere. So agreeing with that is a good predictor of people being willing to have wind development in sight of their home. And so I think this is really interesting because it's this idea of onboarding responsibility for the consumption, for their energy consumption, rather than pushing it off. And so I found that very interesting. Now, within the survey that Ellen ran, we did a little experiment where half of the people who received the survey got this page that showed kind of previous really utilitarian landscape features that had largely disappeared from the landscape. So there was the radio towers we've already talked about, foundries, which were very important sources of local economy. These large hay barns, because of the really, really expansive areas of grazing, not grazing land, of hay land. Back when horsepower was really important, and these have all fallen down, but there were hundreds in the area. And these agricultural dikes, some of which do still exist. And what she was interested in is playing with that past dimension, trying to figure out if kind of being reminded of all these past iterations of the landscape would make people more open to new versions, which is more of these wind turbines in our landscape. And what she found was kind of interesting. It was, again, very exploratory and not a super strong signal. And so you can see here. So what we did is, out of the people who went through that, who got that experimental treatment. So getting the experimental treatment itself had no impact on support for further wind development inside of home, either for those who can see wind turbines from home or those who can't. So that experiment didn't work, but we created a scale out of those who said that they were familiar with those landscapes those 4 landscapes, and then they were sad at the loss of them. And we turned that into a kind of a quasi-climax thinking scale, which we called attachment to vestigial utilitarian landscapes. And remember, Ellen said, okay, we can call it that as long as I don't have to say it. And so it was something that we kind of developed, and she was very uncomfortable with this AVUL. So we just called it climax thinking in her thesis. But so the idea here is that if you can already see wind turbines from home, and you are the kind of person who becomes kind of attached to infrastructure, which is what this predicts, then you're actually slightly more likely to support further wind development inside of your home. And so I think that's kind of interesting. And it's kind of working at that climax thinking interface in a very, this was the first study that used it. And it also kind of means theoretically appreciation for wind turbines can be relatively quickly acquired, because these are people, you know, for whom I think those wind turbines would have been in place maybe 4 or 5 years at the time of this survey. So case study 2 are these focus groups that we ran in Nova Scotia about coastal adaptation. And so this is an example. Some of the photos here are an example situation of resistance to coastal adaptation. And it was a sort of a spontaneous, there was a dike failure, and an area of agricultural land was inundated with salt water and started to restore quite quickly to salt marsh. But you know, the government quickly came in and bought the ag land, and it was really probably going to be a much better idea to just allow that area to go back to salt marsh, give us a little bit of a natural buffer. It wasn't being actively farmed anymore, but the citizens in that area marched and made a massive fuss. And so the government came in, rebuilt that dike, even though it was really without any purpose, because of the need to keep that in stasis. And so what we were doing, so that's one example, but we did focus groups around the coast of Nova Scotia, and we kind of stratified the recruitment so that we were talking to people about nature-based coastal adaptation on the 3 coasts. So the Northumberland coast, the one facing PEI, the Atlantic coast, much rockier, and the Bay of Fundy, which is where some of these agricultural dike lands are, and it's got the highest tides in the world. And so we had 86 people participating in 14 focus groups. And we gave them an 8-question pre-test that was designed to kind of measure climax thinking beforehand. Then we ran them through these focus groups that were about an hour and a half, where we talked to them generally about, you know, climate change, showed them some videos and hearing their experiences with climate change. But then fundamentally, we did these priming experience in the middle. Now, priming is a little bit different from framing. And framing, you're really kind of delivering a message and kind of manipulating the way people receive it by manipulating the message itself. We weren't doing that. We were kind of priming. We were laying the groundwork for people to be responsive to the message we were sending, but we weren't changing how the message was being delivered. So for instance, this video about nature-based coastal adaptation options, including retreat and kind of dike realignment, moving dikes back, restoring salt marsh. It was the priming experiments that we used the climax thinking kind of dimensions to see then how it would influence how people talked about nature-based coastal adaptation and how to talk about it. And then we did another 8-question post-test. So for example, the priming experiments. So we use these sort of 3 dimensions that I talked about earlier. So for instance, for the past dimension, the people who were randomly put into that focus group, and there was 1 of each of these on each coast. I should go back here actually, because there was also a control group that received no priming at all, just went straight through kind of informationally. And so there was 1 of each of those on 1 of each of those types per coast. And in fact, the Bay of Fundy, we had some extra people recruited, so we ran 2 additional ones. So for the past one, this change is just one of many that your coast has faced over time. And how has your coast changed for reasons other than climate change was kind of what we asked people to talk about. The future one, things that you love about being on the coast will persist under adaptation. And so what we asked people to talk about is, you know, what do you love about the coast that you hope future generations will get to experience? And then we had this altruism one, which was that we have faced big challenges before and can do so again. So that's kind of the ethos of the priming. And the topic we chose there was getting them to talk about wartime mobilization. Every small community in Nova Scotia has a cenotaph and sent people and kind of sacrificed in various ways during World War II mobilization. And so we used that as the kind of discussion point. And so what I think our big discovery here was the benefit of having people prime for one another. So we were trying to think, are we going to design some kind of experience? Are we going to tell them about the history, for instance, of their town? Are we going to talk to them about the things that they love? But the best thing that we did was actually make that a discussion point. So we facilitated them to do the priming for one another, to have a conversation among like-minded people from similar coasts who've had similar experiences to talk to one another. I think one of the other things I forgot to mention is that there's certain options for nature-based coastal adaptation that were only suitable for certain coasts. So that was originally why we split people by coast, but it also, I think, created a nice kind of salience for one another, that they knew they were talking to similar people. And so our pre and our post-test statements are here, and we were using just statements to try to, people were asked to respond to them using a Likert scale, and we were trying to understand kind of each of those dimensions that we talked about, the drivers like exceptionalism and ignorance, and the dimensions like past, future, and self and other. And so they answered each of those. Now, what I'm showing here in the pre-test and the post-test shows you that, that we didn't use the same statements. And it probably would have been a lot easier if we had. But because the two tests were really quite close together, could be like 1 or 2 days apart, we were worried that people would kind of remember how they had answered. And so we used different statements that were supposed to be pulling out the same thing. Kind of in retrospect, they weren't as parallel as I would like. The sentiment is slightly different. But so you can see in yellow here is the highest and the lowest are highlighted in yellow for each one. But there is consistency. And when we looked at the statistics, the entire set of 8 kind of hung together as a reasonable scale. And we call that the Climax scale. But these self-oriented statements were very parallel and hung together very well as a 2-item scale. So we called that self-orientation. And so what we have in the next slide, what I'll show is the Climax and self measurements kind of before and after treatment and the tests for each of the experimental treatments. So here we have on the left, we've got the treatments, the scales, and the pre-test and the post-test and a simple t-test to show the difference. And this is discussed in a paper that came out just earlier this year. But what you can really quickly see is that the future framing and the altruism framing had a really big impact on self-orientation, which was the scale that we thought that was actually working really well. It was not statistically significant for past, but it was actually oddly slightly significant for the control group. And I can't explain that. What was also kind of interesting is that the Climax scale went up for the control and the past group. And I think that kind of mobilized kind of a loss aversion. But this gave us the sense that the quantitative results gave it that message. But what was really interesting is the qualitative results did too. So when we were trying to decide which ones we were going to replicate in that Bay of Fundy area, because we had extra recruitment there, it was Krista and I, this is the student who was working on this predominantly with me, Krista Sutton. It was very easy for us to make the decision to rerun a future and an altruism focus group there, because the conversations that we were having were so different in those groups than the ones that we were having with either in the past or the control groups, which were much more resistant to change. So that was really interesting. So the last case study was around Nova Scotia public flood risk mapping. Now, this is something where, for some reason, despite our vulnerability, we don't have widespread publicly available flood risk mapping. And in fact, in some cases, like this case in East Hants in the left in Shubenacadie, when public flood risk mapping becomes available, people often don't like what it says about where they live, and particularly if zoning follows that restricts what they can do on their property. And so this is what we were looking at in this study, and this is just a pilot study. And this was stepping after the last one. We used the same kind of idea of 8 statements to try to measure Climax thinking, to see if any of these dimensions were good predictors of resistance to flood risk mapping, because, you know, even if it's a minority issue, the people who are resistant are often politically quite powerful and can push back and reduce the opportunity to get public flood risk mapping that can then make everybody make better decisions about what they're going to buy, where they're going to build, what they're going to do, right? And so what's interesting here is we chose two of them. We checked correlations for all of them, but we chose two of them that were the most strongly correlated with resistance to public flood risk mapping for reasons of real estate. And I'll show you this, and I'll just show you that. So they're going to be called as statements: not able to cope and no implications for others. This time we didn't make any scales. We just pulled those two statements forward into a regression. Now, the outcome variable here was real estate risks, and that meant agreeing to the statement that making flood mapping publicly available for my area would be too much of a risk for those who may lose real estate value. So that's our outcome variable. And it was very interesting that, you know, the things that one would expect to correlate with that, like experiences with flood, whether it's coastal or freshwater floods, the perception of that floods are getting worse, flood risk assessments, if they've ever seen a flood, none of that stuff predicted. There was some slight significance around sex and education, even owning a home, or even being a parent, something we dropped out of the scale. None of these things mattered. But when we brought in the two predictors from the Climax scale, which was not being able to cope, or that not having any implications for others, it actually kind of those were strongly significant variables, and it quadrupled the kind of power of the overall model to predict that outcome variable. So we're running a much bigger survey. This is the one that Tora, you're going to be using the data from in that kind of place work, but we're running a larger study to capture more variables, and I'll talk about that one in a little bit now. So the key messages from this: first off, I think looking backward is not helpful. So the experimental treatment in the Chignecto survey, where we tried to remind people of past landscape iterations, had no impact on wind support. And the past treatment in the coastal focus group seemed to have the opposite effect of reducing tolerance of loss. Now, I'm not confident that those were the best kind of operationalizations of the concept, but for now, I'm kind of avoiding this as a leverage point. I'm not really looking a lot at, you know, helping people to see what it is, how much change has already happened. I think it actually does mobilize people to kind of worry more about what they might be losing. The second thing from a theoretical standpoint is that climax thinking is not one thing. Climax thinking measures were distinct from place attachment or time and place. I meant to highlight that when we were on that slide. I guess I should have done that for a place of climate change workshop, but this isn't redundant as an idea, but it's not one thing. So neither in the focus group pre and post tests, nor the flood risk mapping pilot study did the 8 statements kind of describing the whole set of dimensions and drivers clustered together. So it's not one thing. It's that self and other dimension statements, both exceptionalism and ignorance, that were important variables in the focus group and flood risk mapping surveys. So my sense now is that climax thinking might be less about perceptions of landscape optimality than about just plain old self-orientation. And so we're doing a little bit more work on that. Third lesson, I think, is that we need to tackle ignorance. Separate to the stuff I showed you, there was a national energy survey ran maybe 6 years ago now that that showed us that support for renewable energy is associated with noticing any energy infrastructure. So what that means is like that if you know about the footprint that energy currently requires, that you actually notice wind turbines, but also just transmission wires, or that the current footprint, that makes you more likely to support renewable energy transitions. And that was a really strong signal across energy. We tested on kind of 12 different energy types, 10 or 12. But in the Chignecto wind survey, the best predictor of willingness to accept renewable energy in view of home was agreeing that wind turbines from my home reminds me that electricity I use has to be generated somewhere. So again, this idea that it is useful to showcase rather than hide the various systems that sustain our lives, such as energy systems. And then that way, the choices and their implications become much more tangible. So people who don't notice energy infrastructure, for instance, are not supporting renewable energy because they don't fully understand the footprint of their lives, right? So that's a really interesting one. And I think that we need to think about that. There's some great books in that space. There's one, I can't remember the name of the author right now, but called When They Hid the Fire. And anybody who's working on energy might find that really interesting as a history of kind of hiding our energy infrastructure, driving a different kind of behavior. Fourth, we need to tackle exceptionalism, this idea that we are special and that rules that apply to others don't apply to us. So in the flood risk mapping survey, one of the two strongest predictors of rejecting public flood risk mapping, I seem to have trouble saying that today, was agreeing that flood management decisions that I make do not have implications for others. And the two experimental treatments in the focus groups, the coastal focus groups, that were associated with reduced self-orientation and increased openness to a proactive adaptation were the future and altruism priming treatments. So looking at future generations and other members of this generation elsewhere. And so right now, I would say that we lack effective ways to encourage collective action and altruism outside of emergency situations. I think we do this extremely well during emergencies, but we struggle to sustain that. Rebecca Solnit says that we have an unmet need for altruism. And that's why it kind of pops up so quickly when something dramatic happens, but it's difficult to sustain. And in fact, this kind of ethos is quite in vogue. When I started looking around, and I've been reading, I just read a book on the weekend called Humankind, which is not in these, but it's another kind of story about how to think big, how to think future, how to be altruistic, and the importance of that, not only for other people and the earth, but actually for our own well-being. So I'm on trend there, I guess. And the last one is that we're more adaptable than we think that we are. So the flood mapping survey suggested that people who reject public flood mapping believe they are not able to cope with the land changes required to deal with significant increases in flood risk at this point in their life. But the Mactaquac case shows that attachment can be relatively quickly acquired for dramatically different landscape conditions. So within a lifetime, people becoming lake people. They were river agricultural people and they became lake mill people pretty darn quickly. And the Chignecto case shows that wind turbines have become part of the Climax landscape of those who can see them from home. And that happened only within 5 years or so. So, I mean, I'd like to explore points of leverage in place adaptability. Although, discomfort with change, I think just seems human, but I think if we don't push past that, then we're going to keep assuming that what we need to do is try to maintain everybody's comfort, right? But in fact, place attachment and kind of the deification maybe of place attachment and the use of that as an excuse to reject significant changes is going to be a real barrier to sustainability. I keep talking to people right now around that it's kind of a choice in coastal adaptation between kind of planned retreat and unplanned retreat, or managed or unmanaged retreat. And we need to kind of put people, help people to understand that change is coming and work on building their confidence that they're up for the challenge of that. So I've got a couple of lingering questions. I think one big one, and what we're working on with this Samantha Howard's survey, she's the one who did the work on flood risk mapping, and she's done a more recent study that includes flood risk mapping and dike realignment. And what we're doing is looking at the mechanisms in a more detailed way. So my kind of preliminary kind of 8-statement tests of climax thinking kind of show us that self-orientation is likely one of the issues, but there's lots of factors, lots of existing scales for measuring these things. And so what we're trying to do is kind of move the ideas of climax thinking into an existing conceptual framework. And on the left here is kind of where that person is and where climax thinking kind of fits. And on the right-hand side are a number of the things that she's measuring in the survey. And so, for instance, hypothesized positive relationship of these ones with resistance to change because they are measuring self-orientation, including kind of environmental value orientations, Schwartz basic values, and Zimbardo's times perspective. So those might be positively associated with resistance to flood risk mapping or to managed realignment. And so that's what we're working on right now, to understand actually not whether or not it happens, but how it's happening. Second thing that we're working on right now is kind of what adjustment to change looks like. And so I've got a PhD student who's just started, who's working along the St. John River Valley to start with, to try to understand those who have been repeatedly flooded there. There's been a buyout program. And we're trying to understand longitudinally what the experience is like. What does reattachment look like? What does reconnection look like to new places? What drives that kind of settling in? The real settlement part of resettlement. And of course, we've got another interesting example now, as Hurricane Fiona came through, and this is the town of Port-aux-Basque. And 100 people in Port-aux-Basque just last week got letters that their houses were, if not already demolished, up for demolition. And I'm waiting to see kind of what they're offered, what support they're given to move forward. And the last one, of course, is the elephant in the room on all this stuff, which is how on earth do we decide what's public good change anyway, of course. So, I've been accused of saying, well, this is just NIMBY. This is just NIMBY in another form, not in my backyard, NIMBY. And I hear that, or that this is just kind of place attachment, but we know that it's different from place attachment, but it is slightly different from NIMBY as well, because it's not simply about rejecting something because of it being close by, but there are these other dimensions in there. And what I'm interested in also is understanding how people receive public good versus more kind of commercial changes, and kind of playing with that interface. So there's been a number of papers and chapters out so far using these ideas. I asked Tora, I think, to circulate the one in the middle here, which was actually submitted in 2017. Books are so slow sometimes, but it came out in 2021. And so that's why there's papers using it that came out before the originating chapter came out. And then more recently in Europe, I actually contributed an essay to this book, Power of Landscape, by colleagues at Wageningen in the Netherlands. That's about novel narratives to engage with the energy transition. I contributed an essay called Learning to Change, Climax Thinking and What Comes After. And so that's available to buy if you're interested. But that's where I've gotten to with these ideas. I think this is, particularly knowing the interdisciplinarity of this group, I think this is maybe a very interesting set of people to have presented it with. I thank you for your attention. And I guess we can just move to questions. I'm just going to stop sharing slides.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kate. This was incredibly inspiring and absolutely relevant to this group. So thank you so much. So while people thinking about possible questions, I'll just start off this discussion with a very simple question. For those of us who are not familiar with the concept of climax thinking, and some people have come in later, so I'm aware that not everybody might be entirely comfortable with that. So if you could just briefly explain what it means and how the concept of climax comes in, that would be useful.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, so to recap, the idea of, I think climax thinking is just kind of fallacious thinking that humans, particularly in the West, I think are kind of prone to, which is where we assume that the landscape that we currently have is the one that we're meant to have, and that by rights we should have. It's this idea that the landscapes of the present really should dominate our decision making about the future. And so we can often, and those of us in the West are quite powerful in kind of pushing our politicians to keep ourselves in the kind of a comfortable state of stasis. And so the climax thinking language is a bit of a theft from ecology, because in ecology, it's a slightly unfashionable concept, but I think students are still taught about the kind of sequence of the predictable sequence of species that will, and plant species that will become dominant in a space as it recovers, or as it becomes established, as soil becomes built in that place, for instance, and it will kind of go up to a predictable climax community for any given set of conditions. And if a fire happens, then that should come back. So this idea of almost a fated one, and if we kind of use that if we think about that in human terms, then it's this idea that the landscape, that kind of sequence of things, these were kind of, there were some pioneer species, there were some pioneer people, right, who came in. They had different needs than us. We can't really relate to them. Their needs were lesser, and yes, they had to experience some change. But that was just because it was preparing for this one. This is the intended one, right? This is the landscape that we're meant to have, just like, and so then if there's something happens like a flood, then the very, very strong pressure to take it, to bring it back and make it the way it was, right? Rather than think, okay, actually, maybe we shouldn't have been building that far close to the coast, or maybe we need to move this. And so what I'm trying to do is sort of think about, how do we get people to not completely disconnect, not, you know, not be place attached, but to think about their places in more of a non-equilibrium way, to imagine kind of a little more dynamism, and to do that collectively. So I guess the metaphor of climax thinking is that it holds insofar, and I'm not an ecologist, so I've been keep worrying about getting really held up on this topic, this use of this term, but it's this idea of the inevitability of the landscape that we currently have. They've kind of gotten past it in ecology, and I don't know yet that we've gotten past it in kind of social science, natural resource contexts. Now, some of the more recent kind of books and works on place attachment and place are really talking about the fact that we have to get past this rooted idea of place, right? We need to get into more of a rhizomatic idea, because, you know, assuming that the best thing is to be rooted in a place, it is now kind of obliterating the experience of most parts of the globe, where people have to migrate for so many reasons, and their landscape shifts. That's no longer, we can't hold that as the ideal. We need to think instead about, how do we build community? What matters to us, you know, and how can we be resilient in our place needs? That was a long answer to your.
I find it almost astonishing how people are apparently very naturally resistant to change in a world that changes rapidly all the time. Yeah, I'd like to.
I think it's hubris too, because we really have the feeling that we can control, say, the ocean, right? And that the ocean, if we just build a bigger wall, it will do it. But in fact, the ocean cannot be argued with. I was at a great event the other day when a guy said how did he put it? The floodplain belongs to the river, and it can take it back whenever it wants.
That's a good one.
Yeah, so we should not be building on it, right? It's not ours.
Yeah, well, that's a very profound idea there. Yeah. Can I encourage questions from the audience, please? We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm sure some questions have arisen. Yes, Sopan, go ahead.
Okay, hi. Okay, first let me get my hand on. Right, okay. So thank you very much for this fascinating talk. And one thing was very clear was how short-sighted and resistant people are to change, no matter what it is. But one thing that I was really a bit slightly dumbstruck by was this resistance to change in the face of a natural disaster, like a flood risk or things like that. But wouldn't economic reality kind of nudge them in the other direction anyways? Think about it, like if the risk of flooding has increased, the insurance companies will definitely put the premium up, the house prices might get affected. So whether or not government acts, it's these other forces will set off in the other direction anyways to nudge people in that direction?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sopan. And I think I don't know if this is something that's different about Canada or Atlantic Canada in general, but we have a very strong safety net, and the government really never lets anybody truly hang out in a vulnerable way like that. So there are, in this last storm, for instance, I think we're used to the government coming to our aid. Let's just put it like quickly like that. In this most recent storm, there are people who were uninsured for whom they couldn't get insurance anymore because of how vulnerable their places were. But they were still living there, and I think they were living there in the confidence that when things happen, the Canadian government comes in and makes it okay, and that's the public purse, right? That's taxpayers that do that. And so that kind of diffuses. It's really kind of a good example of somebody staying put and pushing the impact of their stasis onto others in a diffuse way. It's every single person, other person needs to pay for, and needs to subsidize their personal private good, which is that amazing view that they have, or the sense of rootedness that they feel. But there seems to be that acceptance that the government's going to do that. Now, this is in transition in Canada. And so there's going to be now because the insurance companies are not going to be subsidizing, there is now going to be a kind of a compulsory government sponsored kind of insurance program to make it, to take some of that pressure off the public purse and force people into buying into that. But fundamentally, those signals aren't yet really making people feel that they need to make the change, because whenever I'll tell you, it's good politics to come in on a white horse and save people when things go wrong. It is very bad politics to say you can't do that anymore. And you need to, and I know that you had a plan to build your dream home for your retirement there, but you can't do that anymore. And we really struggle. Politicians struggle to hold their will in those sorts of situations because of all the things that we know about politics, right? So I don't think yet that those pressures are having the impact that they should have, but I think in the next couple of years that they're going to have to, and that there's going to have. So in Port aux Basques, Newfoundland, people are getting demolition notices, but as far as I can tell, they're not yet being given recovery, support notices. Okay, this is what we're going to do. You can't live on that rock anymore. That's just not safe. But we're going to do something else. And so instead, if nothing comes in from the government to help them, the insurance companies will only give money for you to do exactly what you did before. The insurance companies push things, right? Because they don't want anybody to benefit, right? And so they don't trust people to make a smart choice. And so instead they say, you can only get support to build the same thing that you had in the same place that you had it. And that is a big problem. So in that case, the financial incentive is to put it right back where it was, in harm's way. But people also assume that if it was a 100-year storm and they just had it, then they're safe for another 99 years. So sorry, I answered. That was a long answer. I see we're at 1 o'clock for you. Thanks for the question, Sylvan.
Yeah, I've got 1,000 ideas and I would like to carry on discussing, but I am aware that it is 1 o'clock and people will have to disappear. So I won't make people feel uncomfortable about leaving. So I'll just thank you very much again for your very exciting talk, and we'll stay in touch. And I'm sure you'll be contactable for other people in this group as well.
Please just email if you have any other questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Okay,
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.